So I want to thank you all for taking time out of your schedules to join us for this educational session on medical device cybersecurity policy and programs. My name is John Gomez, and I'm going to be your host for the remainder of this event. And I want to get started by giving you a little bit of background on just qualifying who is Sensato, and then we're going to dive into the actual educational portion of this presentation. Sensato was started back in 2013, specifically focused on healthcare, cybersecurity, and critical systems. Since that time, we've been named twice, 2015 and 16, as a top 500 most innovative cybersecurity firm. We continue being a lead innovator when it comes to cybersecurity. This past year, we're very fortunate to be named by Cyber Ventures as a medical device cybersecurity firm to watch. We'll talk a little bit more about what we believe helped win us that recognition as we go forward. We primarily have 3 different areas of business that we present, and I'm just going to give you a highlight on this because I do want to get to the educational aspects of this presentation in short order. Sensato basically has a medical device cybersecurity offering where we focus on medical device security as a packaged service. We also run a security operations center, which we call CTOC, which provides continuous intelligence monitoring and response. And we also provide our own software product, which is Sensato Nightingale, which allows for early detection of breaches and also for coordinated and integrated cybersecurity vulnerability analysis, incident response, and much more. But what I really want to do is focus on our kind of background of medical device security, how we got here, and how we take what we've learned to help kind of give you some insights into policy and practice. As you may have been told when you signed up for this, this is not a marketing presentation. We are going to dive pretty deeply into policy and practice and give you ideas on things that you can institute within your own organizations. That said, I know that some of those that are attending today are on the medical device side of this equation. And so what I would tell you is to kind of think about this, that we're going to talk about this afternoon, specifically on how you can use the information here to help differentiate your products from either a marketing perspective or a technical set. And we're happy to talk more about that. So we started working with medical devices back in about 2015 by performing risk assessments for hospitals, specifically around medical devices. That led us to begin what we call the Medical Device Cybersecurity Task Force back in 2016. The task force is very much a tactical group. The focus is to develop best practices around the securing of medical devices, both from a manufacturer's perspective and a consumer or hospital's perspective. We have about 83 members today, a combination of hospitals, device manufacturers, consultancies, and also MITRE, who is the research arm for science and technology for FDA. It is an open source group. Anybody can join. It's free to join. Any information developed and created by that group is shared openly. The group can be joined by going to mdctf.org, or you can reach out to me directly at john.gomez@sensato.co or to our organization info@sensato.co, and we'll get you more information on how to join. We also, aside from working with hospitals, started working with medical device manufacturers back in 2015. So it kind of gave us an inside-out look at what the challenges are for a medical device manufacturer in securing devices. Since then, we've worked very closely with a variety of medical device manufacturers. We have a bunch of programs that we offer specifically and only to medical device manufacturers, such as writing secure code. We do training for product managers on roadmaps and strategies and differentiators related to security and how you can use that. We've helped organizations develop responses to hospitals who have required information on risk related to devices. And we also do resiliency testing and vulnerability assessment and testing on devices. So we do a lot. We're about to sign an agreement with FDA and NHISAC to develop a 3-way partnership for the sharing of best practices and threat intelligence related to medical devices. So there's a lot we've been doing in this space. And the reason I want to go through this is to help qualify why you should maybe give a little bit of attention to what we're going to tell you on the policy side of this. So what did we learn in doing all of this? Well, we found that most medical devices, regardless of manufacturer, have about 6.2 vulnerabilities per device in a hospital. Approximately 60% of devices in a hospital, and this number is changing in a good way, it's going down, are pretty much running on end-of-life platforms such as Windows CE or XP or something similar. We found that most organizations don't have specific device, medical device cybersecurity policies. That typically there's nothing there specifically around medical device cybersecurity, and that's why we want to do this session today, is to help kind of change that. We find that there's a lack of network segmentation, a lack of continuous monitoring of medical devices, specifically around cybersecurity threats, a lack of implementation and usage of threat intelligence, and an overall lack of best practice and security awareness training. Now, just so you know, this educational session is focused specifically on medical device policies and practices. We are doing subsequent training sessions, which we will send out invites for and post to our YouTube channel as well as our website, around these other areas around network segmentation and monitoring and threat intelligence. So we see this as an ongoing initiative to help both medical device manufacturers designing devices for their constituents, as well as those who are purchasing devices such as healthcare organizations, in how they can both evolve their security posture when it comes to medical devices. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what you should do. We've kind of broken it down into 3 buckets. One is around policy and governance, another around security architecture, and lastly around security operations. Like I said, we're going to focus today primarily or only solely on policy and governance, but that policy and governance does need to drive the security architecture related to medical devices, as well as security operations related to medical devices. So we're going to just focus on the policy and governance today, but as I mentioned, we'll have subsequent sessions that will help kind of round out the other pieces here and help you think about how you can formulate approaches and strategies around those other 2 buckets. So with that, I want to give you a little bit of background on how we got to where we did in terms of medical device cybersecurity policy. Basically, we believe there are 2 types of policies when we're speaking of things from the medical device perspective. Most organizations do have policies for IT security, HIPAA, and potentially to cover state regulations depending on what state you live in. So most people will ask, well, isn't that enough? You know, we have these policies in place, we have HIPAA, we have IT security, and often when we go in and do an assessment, we will call out an organization for not having medical device cybersecurity specific policies. And so, you know, the pushback is, but we have all these other policies and that should cover the medical devices. So here's the fundamental thing. The policies that you primarily have in place, or probably have in place if you're a hospital, are focused on protecting data. Now, this is also the same issue that is facing medical device manufacturers. When you're designing your medical devices, typically you're looking at HIPAA as a way to say that, yeah, we're HIPAA compliant. But again, that's protecting data. When we look at this, and if you know, one thing about our organization is we have an attacker's perspective. We're very, very strong at looking at things from the attacker's viewpoint. And so when we look at it, you know, when we look at a medical device as an attacker, you know, frankly, I am not looking at it to get to the data. I mean, that's a nice little bounty if I can get to it, but ultimately I'm looking at it to see if there's a way I can do harm to a patient, impact patient care. And that's where specific policies related to medical device cybersecurity come into play, right? Because we need device policies that are specific to devices, which ultimately are focused on ensuring patient safety. And things like HIPAA don't really ensure patient safety. I mean, we can maybe debate it and split some hairs, but ultimately it's about protecting the data itself from a privacy perspective, not protecting the patient. And that's a huge differentiator in the current threat landscape that we have before us. So, you know, if you think about it, protecting data is really about assuring that there's no data loss. We want to have the ability to enforce repudiation, which is auditing, the ability to say we know who touched the data and we're 100% sure this is what happened when the data was touched. We want to ensure that there's data integrity, that nothing's affecting that data in transit or at rest. And we want to prevent data leakage, right? So these are the things that typically, I mean, there's a lot more, but ultimately these buckets kind of cover the spectrum of what HIPAA is looking at and PHI and PII. And maybe there can be some argument around this, but ultimately we're trying to protect data with these initiatives. And it's kind of what we have been doing for several years now, probably over a decade, when it comes to privacy and security. What we think is important now is that we shift our attention to how do we protect life. And when we talk about protecting life, the types of techniques and tactics that we use from a cybersecurity perspective are somewhat different. We're really looking for policies and practices around anomaly evaluation. We're looking for things like hazard analysis, the ability to do rapid response, right? The ability for proactive risk management that's timely and current. And if there is a failure in our device or the system supporting our devices, we want to assure that these devices fail safely, fail in a known manner, and we can kind of understand the fallback positions and what ultimately all of these things mean in terms of patient safety. So this is probably one of the most critical concepts, and whether you decide to go build your own policies from scratch or take some of the things we share with you in the rest of this presentation, ultimately you need to be questioning and asking yourself, am I designing policy that is protecting data or protecting life? And then determine, depending on the answer to that, the appropriateness of the policy that you have that you're trying to construct or deploy. So we have kind of a Venn diagram because there is overlap between these, and I want to call that out. This isn't an either or one set of policies only support this or that one supports that. The thing we need to get a real good grasp of is that the variety of policies that we typically see in a healthcare organization or even coming out of regulators will have overlap. There are things that you're going to do from a HIPAA perspective or NIST 853 or high trust or something else that will help provide a better level of security for medical devices. But if you don't take the next step and really have device-specific policies in place, then there is a wide gap that you will leave. And that's a very dangerous gap because these devices ultimately, as we know, could impact patient safety and patient quality of care. So I want to start getting into the components of a policy. So we've kind of talked a little bit about the fact that we have policies protecting data and we need policies protecting life and that there is overlap between them. But now let's kind of dive into, well, what are the components that make up a medical device cybersecurity policy? Well, we think there's three kind of buckets for this. The first is you need components of your policy that address risk management, and we'll talk about what that means. We also think that the policy should have specifically operational management constructs, meaning that you are thinking about how you're going to operate security from a medical device perspective. And then lastly, there are ongoing day-to-day security operations that have to be performed in order to protect these devices. And ultimately, you know, I think, you know, and I'm used to saying this, protect the device is not really illustrative of what we want to accomplish. Our real mission should be to protect the patient. And so we need to make sure that the policies and practices we embrace are really focused on protecting the patient. And although, yes, by complement of that, you're going to protect the device, we need to think about this from a hazard analysis, failing safely perspective, in that ultimately, if the device is compromised, the patient should not be affected or impacted. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And in many ways, and sometimes it can't be accomplished without the medical device manufacturer's support. But medical device manufacturers have their own challenges that they're trying to work through and bring to market. So until that all gets worked out, the healthcare organization does have a responsibility to ensure that the patient is not impacted regardless of what the device's current state is or current ability to fend off an attack. So these components do have kind of different pieces. Now, I will not tell you these are the only things that you should have in your medical device policy, but these are kind of what we would consider the minimum. And we're going to walk through each one of these. You can take these and we will make the slides available to you if you like. Just reach out to us. But these are the minimums. When we have performed assessments of medical device security, these are the things we're looking for. And it's very rare that we'll find them. So it's very hard to kind of find a boilerplate of these that you can then build from. We have developed a boilerplate. It's part of our medical device MD COP program. So that's something that we provide as part of that package solution. But you can certainly take what we're going to give you in this presentation and use it to start building out your own device-specific policies. Ultimately, as a disclaimer, I will tell you that you need to speak to your compliance teams and your general counsel to kind of figure out, is this all you want to do? Do you need to do more? You need to do less? But this is what we look for when we come in to do an assessment. So let's start with risk management and the components related to that. First thing we talk about is acquisition and purchasing. And we've kind of taken the view that we should follow the life cycle of these devices as they go through the ecosystem of a healthcare organization. And so the important part here is to really start standardizing how you're going to evaluate the risk associated with a medical device. And this has to be consistent, especially if there's something that ever does go wrong. You're going to need to demonstrate in court that this was a consistent approach that evolved to meet the current threat landscape. And you'll hear me use that term, current threat landscape, because threats change. And if your policies are out of date, not under governance, then you're going to have a gap. That's an issue, a big issue if we're talking about patient safety. And so it's very important that you kind of have a standardized process for evaluating risk related to medical devices. Now, if you're a medical device manufacturer, it's quite important for you to understand this, because this is going to be something that does impact your sales cycle. And we've actually worked with medical device manufacturers to help them figure out how to streamline and overcome these challenges of risk evaluation by the healthcare organization so that it doesn't impact the sales cycle. So there's two sides of the coin here, and both can work very well together. But the healthcare organization should have, and I would even go as far as saying must have, some form of risk evaluation process for medical devices. And so what you want to do within that is make sure that you are looking for vendor disclosures, right? So you can look at things like MDIS and things like that to see if the vendor has disclosed any vulnerabilities, security issues with their device. And this is important because if you're bringing a device into your organization and you haven't looked for any vulnerabilities and it turns out that they were there and the vendor did disclose them publicly, you're going to need to explain, well, how is it that this device got into your organization and you weren't aware of this? Do you not have a process for understanding vulnerabilities, or rather vendor disclosures? You also want to have a risk assessment framework. Now, this is a much more fancy term than it needs to be, but it's basically a questionnaire that you can provide to the vendor, to the medical device manufacturer, to help them explain to you how their device is actually implementing security. And that needs to be rather comprehensive. Now, as part of the medical device task force that I mentioned earlier today, we have put together a framework, or it's an Excel spreadsheet that you can get. It's 120 questions. We work with a partner who's actually automated that process, and you can outsource the entire risk assessment framework piece to them. Their name's Comply Assistant, and they do a great job at helping to do risk assessments for medical device manufacturers using this questionnaire, this framework that we put together. The next step in this kind of evaluation process is, even though the vendor may have disclosed things and you've done a risk assessment, before the device actually is introduced to your network or your organization, you want to do a vulnerability scan. Now, if you bring this device in and you're going to do a vulnerability scan on it, you probably want to do that on an isolated network. So it's real important that you have that ability. And this is a change for many hospitals where typically they don't have that. They haven't had to deal with this before. But think about it. You're bringing in a device that you may suspect may have some type of a challenge for it. You're going to run a vulnerability scan on it. Do you really want to do that on your production networks? So you need to think about that a little bit. Obviously, cost can be a factor in doing that, but there might be some suggestions we can give you if you want to reach out to help kind of deal with that. The one thing I will tell you, though, is we've had two medical device manufacturers, I'm not going to say who they are, who have had supply chain attacks. And those supply chain attacks have impacted their medical devices, and organizations have brought them in, placed them on their own network, and the next thing you know, the network becomes infected. So the device wasn't really impacted in terms of operations, but the device was a carrier and became kind of the ability of the distributor of this malware. So the vulnerability scan is important and hopefully isolated. You then want to talk about remediation management within this part of your policy, right? You want to talk to the fact that if there are disclosures or if there's something that's found in the risk assessment framework or the vulnerability scan, how you're going to score that and how you're going to remediate it. Because just because there's weaknesses in the product security or in disclosures or some vulnerabilities you find, it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't bring the device in. There is an economic component to this, and there's actually a patient quality of life component and ability to treat patients. So you need to factor all that together, but it should be a policy that says, you know, as long as this, the risk score is lower than this, the product can come in, but we're going to monitor remediation in terms of the manufacturer to get these things fixed. So the point is, you need some type of stated remediation approach. And one of the most important things is the authority to reject. Now, the reason for this is the cardiologist. And I'm saying that jokingly because it's pretty much any clinician. So the reason I say the cardiologist is because for some reason, cardiologists have a reputation for bringing in cool devices, connecting them to an organization's network, and seeing how they work. And next thing you know, you've got devices in your network. Hopefully, if you have a process like this, people are going to adhere to it, and there's going to be times where the risk is too great, and you're going to have an authority to reject, whether that's the IT security team, the clinical engineering team, whoever it may be within the healthcare organization does need ultimately an authority to reject or approve. Typically, we see this as either sits with the clinical engineering leadership or IT security leadership. Rarely do we ever see this as part of the purchasing organization. The policies themselves that we're discussing today, typically we see sit in the clinical engineering group, and that is a change. Mostly you'll see policies like these sit in compliance or IT security, but we see these actually becoming more and more part of clinical engineering because we want them to be aware of the security impacts they have, and they already understand how their decisions impact life. So we want to kind of take the next step with that. So that's kind of where these policies sit. So that's acquisition and purchasing. The next thing is disclosure monitoring. So you've approved the device, it's now in your organization or has been in your organization. You need to have something in the policy that talks to how you will monitor these devices for specific threats, device vulnerabilities, vendor risk disclosures, and then what you're going to do to remediate that. So that's kind of the second piece of this, right? So you've brought it in, you've purchased it, you've approved it to be in your environment. How are you going to stay up to date that there's issues with this? And manufacturers are doing a great job and getting better all the time at disclosing this information and getting it out to people. But you need to have something on your end that allows you to evaluate that disclosure or that report, and then to show that you took action on it. All too often we see that organizations do get the updates from manufacturers, but nothing happens with them. And again, this should probably be part of the clinical engineering workflow. If you make this part of IT security, we find it's too far removed from the day-to-day operations of medical devices. So we want this disclosure monitoring to typically be part of the clinical engineering organization and department. So just something else to keep in mind. So the last piece of this is vulnerability monitoring as part of our risk management. And this is a little different for medical devices than we see for pretty much any other device in any kind of organization, let alone healthcare. If we were talking to a bank, if we were talking to whoever, it's a little bit different. In this case, we want event-driven vulnerability assessments. And what this means is that if any of the following occur, if you update the firmware of a medical device, if you update hardware and software, if there's a disclosure that comes in, we talked about disclosure monitoring in the last slide, if there's an update of a patch for the underlying operating system or something of that nature, or somebody in the organization identifies an anomaly. If any of those happen, you want the workflow to be that, okay, we need to do a vulnerability assessment, or sorry, a vulnerability scan. And that's important because unlike other things, we don't typically look for, we don't run a vulnerability scan if there's a new patch that comes out from Microsoft or Oracle or someone. But in this case, whenever these things happen, we need to make sure that we haven't introduced a security issue. Now, all too often I'll hear, well, a medical device manufacturer must have done a scan. Well, there's an issue that between the time it leaves their development organization, where the scans are probably done, and the device is actually manufactured, put together, and run, we don't know of many medical device manufacturers that are doing vulnerability scans on every device that leaves their organization. So you need to kind of do that. You need to kind of work through doing this when something changes on that device. And again, this is a great opportunity for clinical engineering to make this part of their workflow because they are getting the notifications for firmware updates, they're probably performing them, or they're working with a third-party vendor or even a device manufacturer to come in and do support. They're doing all of that. So to move all of that kind of infrastructure around the support of these devices to IT security doesn't make a lot of sense. You need to get the clinical engineering team to really kind of go ahead and be responsible for doing this as part of their management and maintenance and operation processes. And if none of these things occur, then you want to put the devices at least on a yearly basis, doing an assessment just as part of good normal hygiene practices. Now, this in and of itself is a big difference between protecting data and protecting someone's life. When we're protecting data, this would be considered an onerous task, right? This would not be something we would want to do. It'd be extremely costly. But when we're protecting life, we need to assure that at no point in the process we've introduced a vulnerability. And just one other thing to tack on, like around the discussion or the debate that goes on sometimes, that, well, the medical device manufacturers are running vulnerability scans, or they're surely looking at things before they give them to us. Keep in mind, your own environment may have introduced something. The very tools you use, the laptops, desktops, any of the things that you have in your environment could have created a vulnerability opportunity. And so that's another reason why we want to have event-driven vulnerability assessments. And I'm going to kind of pat my team and I on the back, because this whole concept is something that we've kind of created, this whole concept of event-driven vulnerability assessments. And we're kind of proud of that, because we think it makes a huge difference in mitigating and reducing risk around medical devices. So I want to switch now and talk a little bit more now. We've talked about what do we have to have in our policies to manage risk. So let's talk a little bit about, okay, what about day-to-day operations? And what do we need to have in the policies in that level? So one of the things is really around qualification. And what we mean by this is, okay, so now we're involving the clinical engineering team and the IT security team and probably the compliance teams in a kind of more elevated security defensive posture. Meaning, before we were asking them to protect data, now we're really asking them to protect life. And we need to really think about what do we need to do to help them be successful. And that's kind of a very politically correct way of saying this, right? How do we help them be successful? The non-politically correct way is, how do we help them survive a deposition, right? Because if something goes wrong and ultimately some patients, the patient safety is impacted, people are going to be deposed, and it's going to be the people on the front line. So from a qualification perspective, you really need to outline in your policy, what is the minimum level of experience that someone has to have specific to medical device cybersecurity? What type of ongoing qualifications that they need to maintain, so that if you do get into a situation where it ends up in court, they can speak to the fact that they are truly qualified. Now, obviously, the side benefit of all that, and hopefully what would be the primary benefit, is that you have really qualified people ultimately working with these medical devices from an IT security perspective that translates into a better patient safety, kind of higher level of patient safety ultimately. So what you want to really make sure that these people can do is identify threats, that they can interpret threat intelligence, that they can perform scans and assessments on these devices, that they can evolve the current practices and policies that you put in place for medical device cybersecurity, and that they can interpret threats and disclosures and other items. So, ultimately, really what we want to do is make sure that the people that are working on these devices have the skill set and the knowledge and the tools to do the job that we're saying they need to be able to do as part of the policies that we put in place. And the reason I harp on this a lot is because we often see that this is an area that falls down. Sometimes we just say, oh, Joey's going to do it. He's been doing network stuff forever. He should be fine. But Joey's never been given training. And I can tell you, if it goes to court, Joey's going to have a very bad day. And so is the organization when people find out Joey never had any training or qualification to work in IT security, let alone medical device cybersecurity. So then we switched our focus in this part of the policy to training. And this is really kind of an evolution of current security awareness training practices. So there's a very good chance your organization's already doing this. This is one of those overlap areas that we can probably build upon from HIPAA and PCI and other things that require us to provide ongoing cybersecurity awareness training to employees. So what we're talking about here is just adding to that and making sure that when we onboard employees in an ongoing basis after they're onboarded, they're being taught about anomaly reporting, right? So, and anomalies are really important when it comes to medical devices. All too often we discount the fact that the device isn't working in a certain way and don't think about, well, is this a operational anomaly in terms of something that was misconfigured, or is this something that could be indicative of an attack on the device? So we need to train our people that come into contact with medical devices around anomaly reporting, who they report it to, what they should be looking for, how to evaluate risk, and what are the patient safety concerns, right? And the liability that's exposed as part of this, and the challenges to that. So there's a lot of training or security awareness training that has to go on for the end user in order to do this properly and ensure that you're kind of making sure that your first line of defense is the actual person operating and managing that medical device. And so let's talk about reporting and tracking. We talked about anomalies and identifying anomalies, right? And that's anomaly identification is an important piece of this. But also, we need to track these. And the reason we want to track them is to demonstrate if we ever get audited or if there's ever an issue that it was reported, it was investigated, and it was resolved or remediated. But also we want to look for patterns. Are we seeing a series of patterns for a certain model and manufacturer? Are we seeing the same behavior across different models and manufacturers of devices? Frankly, if we did see that, that should be a real serious concern that we may have something going on here. Single model, single manufacturer still could be a very big concern, but chances are that's something to do either with the code, the operating system, or the configuration of the device. If you're seeing this anomalous behavior across medical devices, you probably have something that you need to look at. The important part is your policy needs to call out the fact that these things will be reported and tracked against so that you can use this as both a learning tool and a strategic tool, but also as a defensive tool if you ever get into a legal situation. This area, network and segmentation, is quite a challenge for most healthcare organizations. And this is something that can possibly be helped by medical device manufacturers at some level, but for healthcare organizations, this becomes a really concerning challenge. We believe the best practice to be that medical devices are deployed to a medical device network, and that network is physically managed and segregated from the main network. Now, except for the fact that some traffic needs to flow back and forth in order to integrate with things like your EMR, or possibly lab systems or other things. But those are kind of very distinct pathways, right? Almost a concept very close to the concept of a zero trust network. But the point is you want to have a separate network for your medical devices. Now, the other thing you want to do is part of this, this policy is not only call out that you should have a dedicated network that's segmented, but that you call out in the policy a procedure for vendors, medical device manufacturers who are deploying their own networks or devices. We often find, like I said, we have a security operations center. Very often we'll find vendors who have deployed their own networks and their own network devices, and the IT or IT security team have no idea that this was done. It's all done through clinical engineering. The vendors, the medical device manufacturer's team comes in, their field engineering team, they deploy the network, they spin it up, and now you have an entire network that nobody knows about. So this has to be blocked through policy. Doesn't mean it's going to happen that you're going to stop it day to day, but you need to put clinical engineering on notice that this is not something that can continue, and that any vendor or manufacturer deployed networks and network devices must be disclosed, and they have to adhere to the same security policies that the rest of the organization does. This is a really challenging, scary situation. We had something through our security operations center occur, and this is one where I will call out medical device manufacturers because we've seen this not just from one manufacturer, but several, where they know that it's a challenge to work with the IT or IT security teams to get their remote support products put in place. They don't want to have multiple support products because it becomes a challenge from a cost perspective, so that's completely understood. But this one vendor, a very large vendor, decided the way to get around that was to use malware. So they've deployed a bunch of their devices using legitimate malware that establishes a reverse shell, just like an attacker would do, and is able to bypass most, if not all, security controls and establish a remote support session with their support team. And I'll say they're in Europe. I'm not going to say much more of where in Europe. But the challenge with that is that you have malware that can be compromised then by an attacker, and the IT security team has no idea this is out there and that this is going on. Our security operations center was able to pick that up, and it eventually got dealt with. But these are the kind of things that have to be called out in policy and cannot be acceptable in terms of just putting this stuff in the environment when we're trying to protect life, right? If we're trying to protect data, this is still not acceptable. But when we're talking about lives, it's a big problem. So you need to call that out in your policy. One suggestion I will give you in terms of network segmentation is that you can take a crawl, walk, run approach. Really, all too often when we talk to healthcare organizations, hospitals about segmenting their networks, we often hear them say that, well, we can't afford it, we don't have the resources, it'd be too complicated. And so, it's kind of like if I asked you, can you do 100 push-ups? A lot of people will say, well, no, I can't. But the fact is, I haven't told you how long you have to do the 100 push-ups. If I said you needed to do one push-up a day over 100 days, chances are you could probably do it or come close. And this is the same approach here. Take a crawl, walk, run approach. Maybe over the next 6 months to a year, you just segment your life support devices. Those devices that if they are compromised will mean immediate and severe impact to patient safety or patient life. Once you have those segmented, think about your diagnostic devices and try to get those segmented maybe next year. And then the year after, work on anything else. So you can turn a project that everybody thinks has to be done in 30 days to something that can take place over 1, 2, or 3 years. You just need to start on it and find a way to get there, and this needs to be backed by policy. So really important and several ways to do it. Patch management. Now, the reason I put this in here, there's probably a corporate patch management policy. This is a little bit different. Obviously, clinical engineering is applying patches and firmware updates and doing that based on medical device manufacturers' recommendations and guidance. But here we want to make sure that there's a few things that are called out in the medical device cybersecurity policy. One is that all team members are aware of the myths related to medical device manufacturers and security. The FDA has a great list of things that most people think, you can't do this, you can't do that. In fact, we often find medical device manufacturers, field organizations, making statements about things that, well, you can't do that, that would trip another 510K analysis, or we'd have to go back for certification. And a lot of that's not true. And this is something we do work with medical device manufacturers to help them kind of understand, before you say those things, you got to understand the liability. If you're telling a hospital that you can't do that because it would trigger an FDA quality inspection or recertification of your product, and it's not true, and something happens, you have a big problem on your hands from a legal standpoint, because that hospital is going to say, we were going to patch it, but we were told by the vendor that that's not something that's possible. So there's a lot here when it comes to patch management and understanding the myths and the realities of what both the medical device manufacturer can and can't do, and what the hospital can and can't do. So your policy should call this out. You should also track exceptions to the patch policy. There are going to be times where, for legitimate reasons, you can't patch. And whatever that reason may be has to be tracked in some type of a log, so that if there ever is a challenge and there ever is a patient safety issue, you can demonstrate that for these reasons we didn't do that. Now, that should probably be occurring already within clinical engineering. So chances are you just piggyback on that. And if it's not, it's a great practice to put in place. This entire concept of patch management should also have a piece around general counsel. That if there is an exception, if a manufacturer is telling you, well, we can't do that, or if we did that, this would happen, or whatever, there should be a requirement in the policy that general counsel for the healthcare, the hospital, is notified. And then general counsel can decide what they want to do in terms of dealing with that risk. So it's a really important piece that goes beyond typical patch management, change management policies that we see when we're protecting data, right? So think about it from protecting someone's life, takes on a very different meaning. So also want to talk about device configuration. One of the things that you will find when you do your vulnerability assessments, some of the things that we found, is that a lot of these devices have an amazingly large attack surface. A lot of ports are open, a lot of services are running by default. And so you need to kind of figure out how to get that information, typically through a vulnerability scan, or you can Nmap, or a bunch of different ways, and then find ways to shut that down. Because the attacks we are seeing against medical devices typically are using ports and services that the medical device manufacturers didn't even realize were open. If you're on the medical device manufacturer side of this, this is kind of a great reason to take, and I guess this is a selfless plug, but to take our writing secure code class, because we talk about this. There's just way too many things that medical device manufacturers ship, which are don't need to be shipped in the configuration they are. We call it secure by design, secure by deployment. And so I'm not going to get into that here, but it's important if you're a medical device manufacturer to help the healthcare organization minimize the attack surface. If you're the healthcare organization, you need to have a policy that says you will review device configurations and then work with manufacturers to reduce that attack surface. It's a real big thing. The latest orange worm attack used the attack surface by medical devices just 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, because of services and ports that were left open by medical device manufacturers. And this isn't just one. This is it's just the way the industry grew up. So just is what it is. Okay, so then we have remote support. We've talked about this. You do need to restrict remote support, or if you're going to have remote support from a medical device manufacturer, they need to disclose how they're doing it, what software is used, what ports and services are required, how they're managing authentication, how they're doing access management. A lot of this is in the 120 question vendor assessment framework that I mentioned earlier on, that you should be putting in place as part of your acquisition and risk management processes. So here I gave you the story about that one medical device manufacturer who was using malware to do remote support. This is the reason we call this out. So you need to really have the manufacturers clarify and have a policy around how remote support will be done. And I have to be honest, as much as we want to say you must use this software product and only this software product, it's very hard. Device manufacturers are dealing with thousands and thousands of clients, and it's really hard for them to have different products that they need to use. So you got to find a kind of happy medium. But both sides of this coin have to be vested in how do you lock down and provide that remote support in a way that protects life. So the last piece of your policy is the security operations components. And that really just comes down to monitoring and response. You definitely want to have monitoring in place. And we are huge advocates of continuous monitoring, deploying network intrusion detection, utilizing threat intelligence to understand what you should be looking for. We are real big on honeypots. And a lot of this is selfish because we have honeypots that we sell. It's called Nightingale BDA. We have a network intrusion detection product under our Nightingale product. The important point here, regardless of where you use it or how you're doing it, you need to do it. You need to monitor the network that is supporting your medical devices and look for traffic or attacks against those medical devices. You can't deploy a HIDS on the medical device or host intrusion detection, so you need to be monitoring that network. And that's a real important thing in this day and age. The second thing is incident response. We do a lot around incident response, and when it comes to medical devices, we believe there's a special class of incident response. First of all, you should be using something called the HIT CRSS, which I'll show you in a moment. But you need to include rapid response as part of your incident response. If you have medical devices under attack, you can't take typically the same approach in evaluating what's going on with this medical device as you do with, say, a domain controller or an EMR. Yeah, they're mission critical, but there's nothing more mission critical than when a device that's potentially infecting a patient is possibly under attack. And the reason that the rapid response capability needs to be thought out as part of your medical device incident response is that ultimately you need to coordinate clinical teams, you may need to notify patient safety teams, but somebody has to be able to say, listen, this device is potentially compromised, we need to swap it out, we need to do something here. Remember, the device could be connected to a patient, and it's real important. There's a lot of things that are going to get triggered as part of this incident response. And so this needs to be thought through really well, and it needs to be a very clear and purposeful, thoughtful part of your overall medical device cybersecurity policies. So that's the security operations piece of this. The coordinated risk scoring is pretty simple. You're going to look at the threat or vulnerability or issue and score it. The IT security team or the clinical engineering team will score that on a 1 to 10. And nobody can question their scoring. That's kind of how we show this. The impact to workflow is going to say, well, if this is real, if this risk actually hits our organization or these medical devices, and it's a 9, what would that mean to our workflow? And that's going to typically be your operational side of the house that does that. The impact to organization actually should say impact to patient safety, and that's going to be the clinical side of the organization that's going to score that. And then ultimately what this does for you is it coordinates everybody from your IT security clinical engineering team to your operations teams to your clinical staff. And it helps everybody kind of have a voice on, okay, we have this risk, we have this issue, how are we going to deal with it? What is the priority of this? But the most, aside from setting priority, the most important point is it gives everybody a chance to bring their expertise to the table and to be part of the response. So this is a much deeper topic. We get into this when we do incident response programs for people, but it just wanted to kind of give you a small taste of it and have you think about, well, how are you going to coordinate incident response across clinical, operational, and IT clinical engineering teams? So I want to touch real briefly before going to questions on our offering. Promise to do this really fast. You know, the reason we kind of did it was that when we were doing medical device assessments, we learned that regardless of the health hospital, we were finding always the same answers. And so it got to the point where before we even went on site, we probably could have swapped out the logos and the hospital's name and then just handed them a report saying, here you go, do this stuff, here's what we found. And I would suspect about 95% of the time it would have been spot on. Now, to do that, the cost of those are typically $25,000 to $35,000 a year. An assessment, and that isn't just us. That's depend. You can go use one of our competitors, and it'll probably be about the same cost. So, you know, we feel that's disingenuous. That if we can come out to your organization and tell you, here's what you need to do, without ever stepping foot in it, then why would we take that business? That's just kind of a silly way to do business and to truly call yourself a partner. So we decided, well, why don't we just take the results of everything we've learned, the recommendations, package that into a single offering, and that's kind of how we created this MDCOP program. MDCOP is basically the three buckets we talked about earlier: policy and governance, security architecture, and operations, all in a single framework. So what we do is we actually give you the cybersecurity policy, like everything we covered today that you can kind of build yourself. We give that to you out of the box. We give you a template that you can then evolve and grow. We give you the vendor assessment framework. We work with you on network segregation best practices to help kind of put a plan in place for that. We help you evolve and replace strategy. We help develop that for older medical devices. How do you address older devices that are end of life but still in your organization and have a 20-year capitalization? So we work through that. You get a membership in our ISAL, which is the Medical Device Security Task Force is now becoming an ISAL. As I mentioned, we're doing a partnership with FDA and FDA and NHISAC, so you get a membership in that. We also provide you the threat intelligence briefings that come out of our Security Operations Center. And then to address the security operations side of it, we deploy our Security Operations Center to help monitor, starting with about 1,000 medical devices to start. We can grow that, but it's kind of a crawl, walk, run program. And we also deploy our honeypot program so that if somebody did break into your network and starts to go after medical devices, we hopefully are able to detect that extremely early in that attack cycle. So the point of this is basically took everything we learned, converted it into a single deployable solution, and the pricing is honestly pretty close to just doing an assessment on your own or getting somebody to come in and do an assessment. So the idea here is hopefully rather than invest in a whole assessment that's going to tell you to go do this stuff, just go do this stuff and you're good to go. The one thing on here that we didn't include in here, but is also part of this, is we do an assessment of 100 devices. So you still have the ability to check the box, if you will, for HIPAA, but it's all a part of one big project. So if you want more information on that, please reach out. You can reach out to me directly. My email address is here on the screen, or you can go to info@sensato.co or our website. But hopefully you got a lot out of this. I know there's a lot to take in just a little bit under an hour. We do provide a CEUs if you are interested. You just need to either email me or info@sensato.co, and we will work on getting you a link to the quiz for that. Once you complete the quiz and pass it, then you'll get a certificate and you can put in for your CEUs. Obviously we'll be sending out a link to this video, so you can kind of refresh everything we said. If you'd like the slides, I'd be more than happy to get those to you. But our number one goal here was to help you kind of understand much more about medical device policies and practices and the things to think about. By no means is this complete. There's definitely room for improvement and evolution. We don't know it all, so it's important for you to think about how this specifically applies to your organization. If you're on the medical device manufacturing side, I'm hopeful that this helps you better understand kind of the challenges and thinking that the hospital is dealing with. And if you can take that and then apply that to how you're designing your products, marketing and selling them, hopefully that drives greater success for you. Certainly, we'd be happy to help and work with anyone that's interested in this space. So please get in touch. But for now, everybody for attending. And we will send out notifications on the next one in the series. We're going to be talking about kind of some of the other areas of medical device cybersecurity, specifically around incident response and some of the other things we touched in the policy side of this in order to kind of help kind of augment that. And we'll continue to focus on that promise to try and make this as educational as possible. Certainly would appreciate your feedback. So if you think there's something that we can do to make it better, let us know. And we would truly appreciate it. So thanks all of you for attending, and we'll talk to you soon.